everybody. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Exo-6 1/6 scale Locutus of Borg figure. And in what is becoming a bit of a trend for Exo-6, I was quite surprised when this figure was first announced, because this wasn't a character I expected to really ever be released, and certainly not really so soon in the schedule when we haven't had some of the major characters, some of the bridge crew from the next generation released yet. In fact, the only character we've had officially from Exo-6 in this line has been Q. So it's quite odd that we're getting some of the major villains before we get our actual crew members for Next Generation. This figure also represents a significant uplift in price as well, and yes, there is some new functionality with this figure. We do get an LED light, for example, but it does have me wondering whether Exo-6 are testing the market a little bit to see whether they can gradually increase the price with each release. And we've started to see this a lot more recently with some of the pre-orders that are on sale right now. Nevertheless, I was really thrilled to have this figure announced because this is a really cool character. This is a significant moment in the history of the Next Generation and probably one of the defining moments in all of Star Trek. So for me, it was a no-brainer that I was going to get this character, and he also has the added benefit of standing in to represent all of the Borg as well. So this is definitely one that's going to look pretty cool in the collection and one I was quite eager to add. So with all of that being said, let's start taking a look at this figure, and as ever, let's kick off by taking a look at this packaging. Now I have to say, I love the packaging for this figure. The first thing to note is that it does have a hard case. Now if you've picked up the motion picture figures, then you'll know what to expect here. But whereas the typical Exo-6 releases have the standard card covers and the slide up sleeve, well, this is all entirely hard case and it has a magnet in the side panel that locks it in place. And the presentation is absolutely fantastic. You'll notice, of course, it has the Star Trek Next Generation logo in the bottom right hand corner. This is in a green foil and it also has a foil banner at the top announcing that this is Locutus of Borg. And we have this fantastic image of the figure himself up front and center. And behind this image is the Borg paneling, the grid-like effect of the Borg technology, which looks really, really well done. It's got very nice green theme running throughout this packaging, which is really effective. Of course, represents the mood lighting that we see on a Borg cube, and this is very effective. This looks very presentable and is definitely eye-catching when you put it on display. If we look at the side panel, we can see the theme of the Borg paneling running right the way around the packaging. We have the green foil at the top and we have the green foil Star Trek insignia. Now, we've seen this Starfleet emblem, the Starfleet Museum on all of the Exo-6 packaging. So this is no real surprise here, but again, it's really nice to see the consistent theme running around this packaging, and this looks pretty nice. And if we flip it and look at the reverse of the package, we can see again the consistent theme running throughout, which looks great. Obviously this is given over mostly to small print, so not the most displayable. You're not really going to want to put this on your shelf, have this facing outwards, but hey, the front more than makes up for it. And so if we open the magnetic gatefold flap there and pull this packaging out, on the interior we can see this sort of black void. There's a QR code there and there's some credits about who's made this figure, and we do have this green card. Now this green card is interesting because this cover actually represents a Borg alcove, and we all know that that alcove is coming to our collection very, very soon. Or at least that's the theory, that's the promise. Behind this we have a protective foam insert, and behind that we have the figure, and as we can see, this figure is nicely secured here. It's got some protective plastic wrapped around it and some foam inserts to keep him in place, and this looks really nice. So then, looking at the figure itself, this figure clearly has some amazing high points, but I also have a couple of gripes as well. But let's kick off by taking a look at the head sculpt. Now, the first thing I want to comment on is that this is a version of Locutus, and believe it or not, there's actually 3 versions of this character in the Star Trek universe. We have Locutus from The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, there's Locutus from The Best of Both Worlds Part 2, and yes, he does sport a very different look in that episode because he's been more enhanced by the Borg by this point. And then we have Locutus as seen in First Contact very briefly at the beginning of the film, in which case he's given a little bit of a makeover that is more in line and more consistent with the Borg that appear in that film. So why am I mentioning this when this is clearly modelled on the Locutus that we see in The Best of Both Worlds Part 2? Well, I mention it because this is a really high-end, very expensive figure. And as we'll see a little bit later, he's quite light in the accessories department. And I thought it would have been really cool to add some extra value to this figure, also keeping in mind the uplift in price for this point for this particular release, if they could have included an alternate head, one to represent each of these three versions of the character, or at least one from the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, because it is a very different sculpt in terms of the Borg technology that we see on the face. Now, as I understand it, such sculpts do exist, except they're very exclusively being kept for certain members of the community. As I understand it, those sculpts actually do exist, they're just not being released on the mass market, and I think it would have been a nice little added incentive, a nice little added bonus to have included them here, because Locutus does have a number of different looks, as I've pointed out, and it would have been nice if we could have swapped out various elements of the armour that we see on the costume, so that we could in effect have two versions of Locutus in our collection if we chose to put them on display. And I'll be honest, when I tend to think of Locutus, I tend to think of him as of the cliffhanger at the end of the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, because it's such an iconic moment, and I always think of him in that less armoured look. Now, I have to say, you know, if I'm going to choose between the two, I actually probably would opt for the more armoured version. You're getting a lot more for your money, I suppose, in terms of detailing and costuming, but it just would have been nice to have had the option, and I think it would have really enhanced this figure, and I'm kind of disappointed that we don't get to choose between the two. And I'll be honest, if they do release another Locutus down the road as some kind of variant, there's no way I'm going to shell out for a variant of this character. It's just too expensive to do that. Now then, nitpicking aside, what do I actually make of this sculpt? Well, I have to say, it's really impressive. I actually love it, I have to be honest. I think they're really bang on target with this. This is an incredible likeness of Patrick Stewart as Locutus. I love the detailing on the face. I love the paint apps on this figure, particularly around the face there. We see that very slight 5 o'clock shadow, which is great. It's such a fine detail that they managed to pull through, but it works really, really well. I particularly love how they've done the eyes there. They've got the shine there that looks really realistic and authentic, which is great. And they've just got the detailing around the eyes looking really, really spot on. So I think this sculpting is pretty spectacular. It's not 100% accurate. There's some little details, some scaling is slightly off with some of the bumps and grooves there of the Borg technology on the face plant, but otherwise this is really good and is definitely Exo-6 back on top form. If you saw my previous video looking at the Shran figure, I was a little bit critical of that. It didn't seem really super sharp as I would have hoped, whereas this likeness is bang on for me. The other thing I also wanted to mention is how Exo-6 have actually learned from past mistakes, which is really, really nice to see, because this figure did come with a special plastic foil around his neck to make sure that the neck wouldn't become tanned or stained, as we saw with the Shran figure, and of course we saw from the QMX Picard a few years ago. So nice to see that they thought this through and they've protected the neckline on this figure. Okay, so I mentioned that this figure does represent a little bit of an innovation in the line because we do have the LED light. Now this is powered by a couple of small round batteries that sadly are not included, which I have to be honest, I was a little bit annoyed by because this is, as I keep saying, a very high-end figure and I would have thought they'd include these two small batteries. Now there is a magnet holding the faceplate in place, so you simply pull this apart and inside we can see the battery holder there, and there's a spring of course, so when you slide the two batteries in there's also a very tiny and minute little switch at the bottom there, and if you move that to the side the red light comes on, and as you can see from this stage the light's really powerful and bright, but when you put the cap back in place and it just slides into place there with those magnets, very smooth and seamless, which is excellent to see, you will notice that the light itself is actually kind of disappointingly dull and small. And although I'm filming this in the daytime with a light on it, so that obviously is going to diminish it somewhat, it doesn't really improve in the dark either, to be honest. But that being said, it's still a very cool innovation and I'm really glad to have it. The other thing I should note is that a lot of the wires on this figure actually can come loose independently of these various plug sockets, and this is intentional to allow you to articulate the figure, remove the batteries, etc. without fear of doing damage to the figure itself, and this works really, really well. Now the tailoring on the figure is pitch perfect. All of these pieces of course are brand new, they're all unique, they've all been specially sculpted for this release, and there's such an awful lot of detail here, especially when we look at the pipes and how they connect up to various parts of the body. What's most impressive actually about this figure is the reverse of it, because we see a lot of intricate detail here, particularly with that piping, looping and crisscrossing around the back there. This looks excellent, really very impressive, and I think they've done a tremendous job with this. This is pretty spot on really when it comes to on-screen accuracy, and I think they've done a fantastic job. Now I did want to focus on the right arm in particular. Of course this is his fully extended Borg arm, which looks pretty cool. Again, very authentic to what we see on screen, which is great. A lot of this piping running through, which is fantastic. And at the end there we have a lot of different paints and we have a lot of different details. In terms of prop accuracy, this looks incredible, really spot on, and the colouring and everything just looks brilliant to me. But what I was surprised by and a little bit disappointed is the fact that this is not articulated. The very end of the arm is not articulated at all, and we do see these bits and pieces moving in the best of both worlds. So I'm really surprised that they haven't thought through that detail and given us some articulation here, because it doesn't seem like it would be a particularly difficult thing to just add a swivel onto some of these pieces. So I'm kind of disappointed that we didn't get that functionality here. But otherwise, the costuming is absolutely excellent and is consistent throughout the entire figure, as you would hope and expect. And there's so many little details on this figure that I'd never noticed before in the show. So, you know, kudos to Exo-6 for getting this spot on and absolutely right. Okay, so let's take a look at the articulation. Now, Exo-6 do warn that this figure is a lot more restricted when it comes to articulation, and again, this is intentional because of the Borg outfit and costume, which I suppose is fair. But there is still some decent articulation here. The head is still on a ball joint, it does move from side to side, it does lean left and right, and it will look up and down a fair bit. Now, again, Exo-6 do caution you to be careful because it might stain and ruin the neckline, so that is something to be mindful of. What's more disappointing is the articulation in the upper body. Now there is a ball joint in the shoulder which will allow the arm to sort of arch out a little bit, but it's not a huge distance. There is a swivel at the top of the bicep there, allowing the arm to arc out a little bit. There is a hinge there, I think it's a single, it might be a double joint at the elbow, allowing the arm to bend to roughly 90 degrees, and it will arch outwards, but yeah, you are starting to feel the restriction here. Likewise, when we look at the wrist, there is just a plain swivel. There's no ball joint here, so it will not allow the hand to hinge forwards and backwards at all. It just spins around. And the same remains true of his Borg extended arm as well. So there is a straight swivel here at the end, so it does allow the arm to at least rotate around, if not the individual pieces at the end of it. And sadly, when it comes to the torso, there's basically no articulation at all. I think there may well be a swivel or a ball joint around the lower abdomen there, but I can't really get anything out of this at all. Likewise, if you try to bend this forwards or backwards, it's not going to happen. Now, there are ball joints in the hips, allowing the leg to kick out to the side a fair decent amount. And the leg, of course, will kick forwards and backwards. Again, not a huge amount, but enough to be able to put him into some interesting poses, I suppose. And then we have a joint at the knee. Now, this may well be a double joint, but all you're going to be able to get out of this is a 90-degree hinge there on the lower leg. And then finally, we do have a ball joint, a very clear ball joint at the ankle there, allowing the foot to move from side to side, hinge forwards and backwards, and arch left to right, which is pretty fantastic. The only downside to this is that you do have to be careful with how you present it, because unless you pull that sleeve down off the shin pad, you will see this very ungainly, very unpleasant ball joint, which looks really strange and ruins the whole look. But hey, that's absolutely fine. Again, Exo-6 have thought this through. You can pull this down so that it covers, and it covers that gap very neatly, and it looks fairly seamless. So, moving on to the accessories, and unfortunately Locutus is disappointingly light in this area. He just comes with two alternate left hands and the display stand, which is the transporter stand that we've had several times before already. It also comes obviously with the alternate cover that you can put in here, as you can see, but as I said, a little bit disappointed that we're getting this stand every single time now, regardless of series or indeed film or franchise, because we've had this for the motion picture figures, we've had it for our Enterprise figures, and it's just really frustrating to see the same stand over and over and over again. I was hoping this would be more bespoke depending on the character, so this would have been nice if it just been, say, a green transporter to, capture the spirit of the Borg. What would have been even better, of course, is to actually have some sort of alcove, which would have been very cool. I know obviously we're going to be getting that, and it's going to be probably around about the same price as this figure to stand him in, but it would have been cool if we'd had something that was, representative of the Borg here, as opposed to, the typical Starfleet transporter. He does also come with this plastic plaque as well, which is quite nice for what it is, but it does feel a little bit large and unruly to really put in front of the stand for my perspective. To be honest, I'm not hugely enamoured with the additional spare hands either, because they're all much of a muchness really. They're all open hands, some are slightly wider like this one, whereas the other one's slightly more of a gripping hand, but even then there's nothing to grip. And there's no real difference between this and the hand that's already on the figure if we take a closer look at that. So as you can see, these all feel very kind of samey really, and whilst maybe Locutus doesn't necessarily make a fist in the show, it would have been cool if he came with a fist. There's something that was clearly, definitely distinctively different to the other two hands, because this just feels very limited and samey. So then, in terms of my final thoughts, a little bit of mixed feelings on this figure. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the video, this is coming in at a slightly higher price point than the other Exo-6 figures, and aside from the LED light, bearing in mind they don't include the batteries, I'm not entirely sure why. What is warranting that extra cost? The figure itself is very nicely done in terms of the costuming. In terms of the costuming and the sculpting, pretty much pitch perfect. I could not fault this figure, and I think they've done an excellent job. Likewise, I'm really pleased that they're starting to think through some of the issues that we've had with previous releases, so putting in that cellophane wrap around the neck, for example, to stop it tanning. That's really good, that's really helpful. Really glad to see that they're proactively thinking about this kind of thing. But then I am a little bit disappointed by the articulation, to be honest. This feels more of a statue than it does an articulated figure that I can put into lots of interesting poses, and I know the counter argument is that, well, Locutus is a bit more stiff and robust, but nevertheless, for my action figure, I wanted to be able to move a little bit more. I want to be able to put him in different poses that makes him look imposing and interesting and, eye-catching, rather than just standing stock still and not really being able to do an awful lot. There's a couple of little bits and pieces when it comes to the end of the arm there not being fully articulated. That is disappointing, and I'm not quite sure why it isn't. Maybe they felt it'd be too fragile, too liable to snap, perhaps. But we've seen much more finer work done in other releases, so I'm not quite sure if that is the issue, really. So yeah, I kind of got mixed feelings about this figure. I really like it. I'm really glad to have it in the collection. Of course I am. It's Locutus. It's a really significant character, a key moment from the franchise, and I want to have a Borg in my collection. So this is definitely doing that job. It looks really cool, and I do like the light. I think that is great, even though it's a little bit disappointing in how bright it is and how large it is. But again, it does do the job very, very neatly, and it does look great on display. There's no two ways about it. Likewise, the packaging, really displayable, looks fantastic. It would have been cool if there'd been some alternate accessories. For me personally, this is where I think the added value could have come in, as I mentioned earlier. Rather than having those alternate left hands that don't really do an awful lot, how about an alternate head? How about the ability to remove some of the armor pieces that we see on top of the chest area to have two different looks? Perhaps we could have removed that right arm and had a fully extended arm with the ability to have a right hand, as we see in part 1 of the Best of Both Worlds. Having two distinct looks for this character, I think, would have warranted the price, and it would have been more satisfying overall. But that being said, it's not a bad entry, but it probably is only for die-hard fans of the character and of this episode, or of the Borg. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.